We've all heard of the crazy laws that exist in the United States, like how it was illegal to put pineapple on your pizza in some states, or how it was once illegal to dance while wearing pants. But what about the craziest laws ever signed by the presidents? You might be surprised at what some of these presidents thought was necessary legislation. So grab a slice of pizza with the pineapple on top, and let us take a look at the top 10 craziest laws ever signed by U.S. presidents. Number 10. The Independent Offices Appropriation Act of 1952. As the United States entered the Cold War era, fear of communism gripped the nation. President Truman signs an act which prohibited government officials from accepting gifts unless they were of nominal value. This included gifts from foreign governments. While this may sound like a common-sense law in today's world, at the time it was a major scandal. In fact, it led to the resignation of one senator and the censure of another. The law was later amended in 1964 to allow for gifts from foreign governments as long as they were given in a diplomatic context. However, the law has had a lasting impact on government officials who are still prohibited from accepting most gifts today. No. 9. The Hatch Act of 1939. In the run-up to World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was concerned about the influence of partisan politics on government officials. So he signed an act into law that prohibited federal employees from engaging in political activity. This included making political contributions, campaigning for candidates, and even running for office themselves. At the time, many civil servants were already active participants in politics, and the law was met with much opposition. However, it was seen as a necessary measure to ensure the neutrality of the civil service and protect against any perceived conflicts of interest. After decades of debate, the law was finally repealed in 1978. However, its legacy lives on in the form of various ethics rules and regulations that govern the conduct of government officials today. No. 8. The Federal Firearms Act of 1938. During the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was determined to tackle the issue of gun violence. He believed that reducing the number of firearms in circulation would help alleviate poverty and unemployment, as well as reduce the number of crimes committed with guns. So he passed a law that imposed a tax on the sale, ownership, and transfer of firearms. However, the tax was so high that it effectively banned the sale of most guns. The law was also enforced in a discriminatory manner, targeting African Americans and other minorities who were already marginalized and subject to strict gun control measures. After much criticism, President Roosevelt eventually repealed the act in 1940. However, his actions did set the stage for future gun control legislation. Number 7. The Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. As the United States prepared to enter World War I, President Woodrow Wilson was determined to cut off all trade with Germany and its allies. He signed the Trading with the Enemy Act, which allowed the government to seize and confiscate the property of enemy aliens and gave the president broad powers to block transactions with people or entities deemed to be hostile to the war effort. However, the law was so broadly worded that it could be applied to anyone who was deemed to be an enemy of the United States. This included not just actual enemies of the country, but also those who were critical of the government or the war effort. Many people had their property seized under this law, including conscientious objectors and pacifists. After the war, most of the property that had been confiscated was returned, but not without significant damage to the owners. The law was finally repealed in 1921. Number 6. The Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917 and 1918. Amid growing anti-war sentiment, President Woodrow Wilson signed acts that made it illegal to criticize the military draft and other aspects of the war effort. These acts were used to crack down on protesters and silence those who opposed the war. Eugene V. Debs, a prominent socialist leader, was convicted under the Sedition Act for his opposition to the war, and many other activists and journalists faced prosecution under these acts. After the war, these laws were used less frequently, but they remained on the books and were used during the McCarthy era to target suspected communists and other dissidents. It wasn't until the 1960s that these laws were finally repealed, although their legacy continues to have an impact on our civil liberties today. No. 5. The Alien Registration Act of 1940. With the United States on the brink of entering World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an act that required all non-citizens to register with the government and carry identification cards. This act was part of a larger effort to crack down on immigration and keep the United States safe from potential threats. However, the law was seen as a way to target immigrants and people of color and was widely criticized as being discriminatory. Despite the backlash, the law was not repealed until 1976 when the Immigration and Nationality Act was passed. This act abolished the requirement for non-citizens to carry identification cards and made other changes to immigration law. Number 4. The Page Law of 1862. President Abraham Lincoln signed a law that barred anyone who had engaged in an insurrection or rebellion against the United States or provided aid and comfort to enemies of the United States from holding any federal office. This was done to ensure that people who had supported the Confederacy would be barred from holding office and potentially undermining the newly reunited country. However, the law was also used to target people who had served in the Union Army but were now deemed to be disloyal for their political beliefs. The law remained in effect until 1913, when President Woodrow Wilson pardoned all remaining Confederates. While the law's intent was to ensure national security and stability after the Civil War, its application was often inconsistent and unfair. No. 3. The Alien Enemies Act of 1914. In the years leading up to World War I, President Woodrow Wilson was concerned about the growing threat of German spies in the United States. He signed an act that allowed the government to detain and deport non-citizens who were deemed to be a threat to national security. However, the law was so broadly worded that it could be applied to anyone who was critical of the government or the war effort. Many German Americans were arrested and deported under this law, even though they had done nothing wrong. The law remained in effect until 1920, when it was repealed as part of the Immigration Act of that year. No. 2. The Sedition Act of 1918. As the United States entered World War I, President Woodrow Wilson signed an act that made it illegal to criticize the military draft and other aspects of the war effort. The law was used to crack down on protesters and silence those who opposed the war, including Eugene V. Debs, a prominent socialist leader who was convicted for his opposition to the war. The Sedition Act remained in effect until 1920, when it was repealed as part of the law that also repealed the Espionage Act of 1917. Number 1. The Smith Act of 1940. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an act that made it illegal to advocate for the overthrow of the government and made it easier to deport non-citizens who were involved in subversive activities. The law was part of a larger effort to suppress communist and socialist activity in the United States and was widely criticized as being a violation of civil liberties. The Smith Act remained in effect until 1961, when it was repealed as part of the Civil Rights Act of that year. The United States has a long history of passing strange and sometimes contradictory laws. From the early days of the Republic to the present day, the country has seen its fair share of bizarre legislation. Some of these laws were clearly unconstitutional and have been struck down by the Supreme Court, while others remain on the books to this day. Regardless, these laws provide a fascinating glimpse into the history of the United States and the evolution of American society. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and check out our other content. Thanks for watching.